Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I will be discussing The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu, the first book in the Dandelion Dynasty. And this is a book that I had pretty complicated thoughts on. I did overall enjoy this book, and this is probably going to be one of those reviews where I'm going to be back and forth with positives and negatives. So I'm just saying, I did enjoy this book. It didn't blow me away by any means, but it was an extremely well-written book, and it set up a lot to the point where I think that the rest of this series may very well careen it into a much higher ranking for me. But this book, though excellent, especially for a debut, I definitely had some issues with as well. So let's talk about what The Grace of Kings is about, because that's kind of a loaded question, talking about what it's actually about, because this spans quite a bit of time and quite a few characters, areas, all kinds of things going on. But at the heart of it is we are looking at essentially, I was going to say a nation, but it's several nations, well, an empire, as revolution starts. And the book doesn't just follow a couple of characters, you know, who start the revolution or going through and fighting. It follows quite a lot of different people. We have point of views from both sides of the conflict, as well as kind of large and small characters. Some we see for a while, some we don't. And that's the first thing that I thought was really, really interesting, is because instead of doing the kind of the fantasy thing, it's more like it's documenting all of the different kinds of people. And the characters in this book are usually quite complex and have a lot going. So we see, we see some people who truly are, wanting to fight for freedom, some people who are doing it reluctantly, some people who are just out for power, and we see some people who are more successful than others, some people get killed, some people win, lose, whatever, and all kinds of different motivations for the different characters that we follow. The two kind of main characters that we follow, despite, like I said, there are quite a few other characters that are introduced, are Kunigaru and Matazindu. Both of these characters are incredibly different, very, very different personalities, very different motivations, and in a lot of ways are nearly opposites. But the way that these characters play off of others and each other as well works really, really well. I did love the character of Kunigaru. It was a really, really great character. Did some of the things I like, the kind of like slacker character who's, just going through life looking for adventure and then definitely finding some, versus Matazindu, who was raised very austerely, is very, very bound into honor, sees things a lot more black and white, and so is kind of finding out more about the world and the way that it is, and trying to balance that with the way that he's been brought up as well. These two both are integral to the plot and to a lot of the different things that are going on. This book is everything from like skirmishes to raids to sieges to political machinations to everything from airships to there are like giant narwhal whale things called Krubans. There's a ton going on here, and the amount of world that is built is pretty astonishing. This is a pretty long book, but it does really do a lot to build up the world, and so that's definitely a positive thing. This really did almost feel like there was enough content for a couple of books just on its own with what was told here. Like I said, I think a lot of what was set up will hopefully pay off in the rest of the series, because this really, really does set up a ton of stuff. And where I start getting into some of my complaints, some of it has to do with more so just the structure of the narrative and the writing style that's used. Because like I said, I did have some complaints that hampered my score and my enjoyment a little bit, despite the fact that, I've just been talking about all of the great things with the world building, the characters, those kinds of things going on. One particular thing that was just, I found quite odd, and apparently, because I should have mentioned before, But if you want to hear spoiler thoughts about The Grace of Kings, I did participate in a live show where we discussed in depth this book in spoilers. So check the link in the description for that. I will make sure to link to that video if you do want to watch and get more of an in-depth conversation with myself and others we had a pretty wide variety of opinions on a lot of different topics. So definitely check that out if you're interested in hearing more. But with it, from there, somebody mentioned that it has to do with the sort of storytelling it comes from, where you basically introduce a character and then immediately tell their backstory and kind of go from there. That happened a lot in this book, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, but it just kind of kept happening. Even quite late in the story, we're getting characters introduced, and then we're taking that chapter to go over their backstory and their motivations, and sometimes they stick around. There was a character like that became a character I really, really enjoyed, and one of my other favorite characters throughout the story that was introduced way late in the book. Other times they may die off quickly, so you never really know, and so at times it just feels like the story stops a little bit to introduce these characters. That plays into, in general, this reads very different from the typical fantasy novel. It read more to me kind of like a classic, with just that different kind of storytelling, the way that it's done. Apparently it does take, I can't remember the exact term, but there's a type of storytelling that comes, I believe, from China. Is like I said, it was mentioned, somebody commented on the live show about it. That's kind of done that way, and that's a bit of how this is done. It's apparently not supposed to happen as much in later books, but it just kind of was a little bit jarring, because like, we're going forward with the story, that all of a sudden, nope, we're going to stop, and we're going to learn about this new character. And they may or may not be important. You just have to wait and find out. And so that felt a little bit jarring as it continued to happen. And that really, though, my other complaint also happened later in the book, where it kind of felt like, I honestly compared it to like Spy versus Spy, where we just had two sides kind of going back and forth, like always upping the ante, having some new harebrained scheme or trick or thing going on. And we would see the thing happen, and then we would go back and sometimes in extreme depth explain what all the setup for that was and how it came to be. There was one particular one where it was really interesting. Like, the explanation was interesting, but it just felt like it went on forever. And I'm like, I get it, okay? I don't really need all of the ins and outs. I've heard that to an extent some of this continues in the series, where there's like in-depth passages of doing math, or like, you know, figuring things out like that. And so I'm curious to see how that turns out. But it wasn't like a huge thing. It just, like I said, started to annoy me a bit as we continued on, and it just felt like that took me a little bit out of the story. Overall, like I said, this was extremely well written. It is a bit slower, and it's definitely a lot to take in, so that's something I do want to mention. I tend to like slow build-up type books. This one, though, honestly, the pacing reminded me, probably more than anything, of Magician by Raymond D. Feist, because that was a story that also took place over a length of time, and it was specifically about a war, and we would kind of jump forward and then see different people, and sometimes we would get some newer people in there as well. This adds a lot more characters than that book did, but kind of in that same vein, this takes place over quite a large amount of time. It's my understanding that the series as a whole takes place over a very large amount of time. It is called the Dandelion Dynasty, so I assume we're going to be looking at like a dynasty over time. So that does make sense. But that is something to be aware of with this, is it does take a bit to get going. The story and the character that I liked the most was very, very good early on. And so for me, actually, funnily enough, despite the fact that this is kind of a slower burn, I enjoyed it more toward the beginning, and it was the further we got in, closer to the end, where some of those things started to grate on me a little bit, just because they kept happening with like the new characters, the long explanations, that sort of thing. It wasn't enough for me to dislike this book at all. This is one of those weird books where it's very good. It's very well written. I enjoyed it. The prose, for the most part, was really well written as well. But it's just like, it's one of those things. It's one of the better books that it has still managed to annoy me. A lot of times I'll forgive things like that if a book's really, really good. This one was kind of kept itself firmly in the middle, because despite the fact that I think it was very good and I enjoyed it, some of those things did just start to grate on me a little bit, like I said. So that kind of happened as well. But it was very, very interesting. Like I said, too, honestly, it's the different types of characters and the very broad view of a revolution. The book does do a lot of kind of discussion on the philosophy behind rebellions, revolution, justice, what ruling is like, different types of rulers, and I found all that to be very, very fascinating. Like I said, it at points it honestly read almost more like a fable than a fantasy story, and that can be a good or a bad thing, and I think it kind of just depended. Like I said, some of it worked, and I'm like, oh, I still really enjoy this. Some of it was a little bit odd. Another big thing that was interesting with this book is there are gods, and they are present throughout, sometimes kind of directly, sometimes not. And the role they play, this is something we discussed a lot in the live show as well, the role they play is really interesting because they definitely are picking sides, and potentially influencing events, but not directly participating for the most part, because as we find out, they have like kind of a truce between all of them that they won't directly interfere. So there's a lot of questions of free will and choices and other really big topics that are discussed here, because there are times that you're looking like, oh, was this really the character, or was this because they were pushed in this direction? And the gods definitely do like to meddle in this book. It explores a lot of topics, like I said, not even just like the war, the revolution, justice, ruling, but also the idea of love and marriage and relationships, and a lot of other topics like that are looked at really in depth and are looked at in really interesting ways as well. Definitely in ways that you don't see discussed a whole lot. And so I found a lot of that to be very, very fascinating as well. The writing, like I said, the prose is very good. It just did at times kind of almost feel, once again, like it wasn't necessarily telling me a story anymore. Sometimes I felt like I'm reading like a manuscript about how things are built or something like that. So it did kind of have those moments where it got a little bit hit or miss, but overall was very good from that regard as well. It's just, like I said, this was a book I had really complex opinions on, and I was hoping I'd be able to give them in a less rambly way after doing the live show where we talked about it in depth. But I still just had very complicated feelings, and I think you can probably tell that by this point in the video. You could probably tell that quite a bit earlier in the video because of the fact that I have already been rambling a little bit. Otherwise, the one other thing that I specifically want to mention is there are times where, like, the betrayal trope, I guess is what I'm going to call it, is overused a little bit, where we just see, like, I'm going to betray you, you're going to betray him, we're going to all betray this person, and we see that kind of overused to an extent at points, was one of my other kind of minor complaints. Like I said, that kind of played into how parts of this book felt kind of spy versus spy, where we're just going to like double cross at the double cross, you know, and that kind of thing. And it honestly, like I said, despite the fact that I've had some complaints, I feel like I gushed and then I like complained. So I've done both. This is definitely a book I think is worth reading. Hopefully my still somewhat muddled thoughts have helped determine if it's going to be for you. This is definitely one of those books I feel like some people will not enjoy at all because of the story, like the style, I guess, in the narrative, not the story itself, but the narrative style, the way the story is told, and just the overall like complexity and depth of what's looked at here. Some people just don't like to dig that much into stories. I usually am someone who enjoys that, and even I found parts of it where I'm just like, I don't care. So I can get it. I can definitely see both sides here. This is really one of those books that with a few, like if there were a few things that I liked more or a few things that I liked less, this could easily drop down to more middling or to a much higher type rating. And so really it does, this is one of those books where I have to say I feel like it has a lot of potential, and it will take me continuing the series for me to decide if I think that potential is met and it gets to where I think it could go, or if it does not. And I have been told that the second book is apparently, I've heard people say, is just like better in every way than this first book. And people who've read the whole thing also, I've just heard that have absolutely loved it and said it's amazing, goes in unexpected directions. So I feel like it has a lot of potential that I've gotten from this first book. And so I am very interested to see how I feel about the rest, because right now it's a book that I enjoyed. It's not a book that I'm crazy about, but it is definitely a series that I'm interested to continue with and see how I feel. And with even, just a bit more, this I feel like could really, really elevate the series for me. So I'm interested to see where that goes. But that's all I'm going to say about that. Apparently I'm Forrest Gump now. But like I said, if you want to see me and others talk much more in depth about the book, check the link in the description for the live show where we talked about pretty much everything. We talked about a ton of topics, and it was really interesting. This was definitely a book. I feel like that the best way to talk about it was with other people who read it as a part of that buddy read for April, and also just be able to go in depth for extended periods of time. So it was really great. I enjoyed it. I'm going to try and read the second book in May if I can, but I don't know if that's going to happen or not. But if I don't end up reading it right away in May and being able to participate in the live show, I definitely will be continuing because I'm very interested to see where the story goes. If you like this video, make sure to give it a like. Check the link in the description for the Wizardly Do It Discord. If you want to chat this book, other books, any books, really anything at all, it is a lot of fun and we would love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.